In this video I'm going to take you through how I like to fish along rock walls with these shrimp patterns, and, you know, imitating a prawn or a live shrimp down along these rock walls. You can see I've got like a mangrove lined bank on one side of this creek, and I'm chasing mangrove jack this morning, and at times if there's a little bit more cover and shadows you can fish these shrimp on either side, and they're super effective along slow banks, like slow receding banks with mangrove pneumatophore roots. These are fantastic because they're weedless. But this morning what I'm going to do, because the tide hasn't quite pushed in up there onto that bank there, I'm going to fish this rock wall, and these are super effective. There's a whole range of different shrimp patterns out there, like there are absolutely heaps. I've got a video actually going through a heap of these shrimp and prawn imitation lures that talks to you about which ones to use for certain conditions and how to retrieve those specific for each spot. So make sure you check that out. I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. But I've just chosen this Savage Gear. This is like a 3D TPE shrimp, and it's got like a Kevlar tail, so it's a really loose tail. It's just got some matting in there holding it together, and then it's got those little feelers in the legs in there. And I'm going to show you how these things work better when you fish them with a little bit more of a nuanced retrieve, a little bit more attention to detail when you're bringing it in. So I've got a beautiful rock wall here, and the jacks tend to get along these rock walls, especially early morning, late afternoon with a little bit of tidal flow. It's crazy fishing, and I've got two different setups that I use when I go jack fishing. One is like a lighter 3 to 6 kilo, that's a bass raider, and that's a much lighter tip. It's really good for skip casting, and you can use that when you're fishing in undercover. But when I'm fishing along these rock walls, I like to fish with my much heavier bait casting setup for mangrove jack. And this is a 8 to 10 kilo super heavy action, which just gives me casting accuracy. It's only 5'6", but it also allows me to put some real hurt on the fish and pull them out once I've got them. So you can see it's got like a weedless rig there, and it's very loose, so you kind of want it sitting fairly covered, that hook, and only being exposed once you hook up. But the hook sitting up is pretty good, pretty weedless anyway. So I'm just going to drift along this bank and show you how I like to fish it. There's a heap of boat traffic out here today, and they're all putting crab pots in, eh? There's more crab pots being laid out in this creek this morning than there are crabs, I swear to God. And they're all just like smashing it around at like 20 knots too. So we're going to get interrupted with a fair few boats, I reckon, coming around this bend. Ideally you want to be out here first thing in the morning, like super early in the morning, and flicking these shrimp around the edges of these rock walls. So I'll take you through the technique really, and what you're wanting to do is like just lift it in against the edge of the bank and give it plenty of time in there. And you might notice like I'm drifting with the wind here. Hopefully it doesn't get up too bad, but if you've got tide or wind, you want to drift with that. You don't want to be like carrying on in your boat or your kayak and motoring everywhere and being real noisy as you're doing your drift. You're trying to be as stealthy as you can to not scare the bait, let alone the mangrove jack. But if you can just keep it quiet and have the bait unaware that you're here, then there's a fair chance the jacks aren't going to be tweaking onto it as well. If you're scaring bait all the time as you're heading along rock walls, it tends to turn the other fish off as well. They just know that something's up. So what I'm looking for primarily, like I'll fish a whole rock wall if it's a real standout feature of a creek, which it is here. But you might be able to pick up, there's like just little edges where it comes out and juts out, and it's those little pressure points where the jacks will sit off. And if you've got a scanning unit you can see it, but it's easy enough from just looking at the surface structure and the bends in the bank and the water disturbance where those are. And they're your primary targets really. So when I'm casting it out, I'm just trying to let it sit and sink down super slow. And you can do it completely like with a slack line like I am now, just letting it go down. But you better be watching your line, because if you get a little nip or a tick, that can be a jack or a jewfish coming up and just sucking it in and not being really aware of what's going on because it's such a slow moving, slow presented bait. But what I usually like to do, especially with a little shrimp like this that's got these little legs underneath. Those legs have a fantastic action when they've got a little bit of tension to them in the water and they're just moving through the water. They'll wiggle and walk in the water. So the way I like to fish it is actually under just the slightest of tension. You're not retrieving it in, and you're definitely not like rip like you would a jerkbait for mangrove jack, but you just sort of a half turn of the line gives you tension to pull the lure in. So it's just under enough tension so that the balance of this lure, it's not necessarily sinking down, it's sort of sitting naturally like that in the water and those little legs are moving. And that's a real game changer in terms of just presenting this lure with a much more realistic presentation where you can. You know, when you don't have any tension on it, it's sinking down, but once you get it down that, 3-4 feet down the edge of these rock walls, you're in the strike zone and you want to kind of keep in contact with that lure. And the most you're doing is just I'll show you, the most you're doing with your rod is just the slightest little like tink tink, just to pop it out off the rock wall and then let it go back down. So it's super subtle with these things, and the slower, the less you can do with these little lures, the better they are. You want them like crawling down the edge of the rock wall and then trying to stay balanced when they're sort of sitting there down the bottom in that strike zone. And I'm fishing with 20/20, so 20 pound braid, 20 pound fluorocarbon leader. You can see, hopefully you can pick all this up, but this is like oyster encrusted rock bar, which is just deadly for trying to pull a jack out and keep attached to it without getting snapped off. So you really need to have maybe even heavier than 20 if you're just getting started, but I tend to try and go as light as I possibly can without just getting snapped the whole time and just donating lures. It's very realistic for a prawn to be facing into the current, obviously like not moving fast against it, but just facing into it and basically just stalling its way through the tide and sitting there is all that you want to be doing. So it's a much slower, more subtle technique than anything I'd do with a diving lure or a popper even. But boy, once they tune into it, if you're in the right zones and you're getting it down deep enough, they can smack them and they just go as hard as they ever have. But these can be an ideal, decision to make when you've been fishing like I have this morning. I've been skip casting. I've got one little jack on a diving lure. Now the sun's higher, there's boat traffic. I reckon the jacks go a little bit deeper at that. And so fishing this is an option if you want to stay out and extend your session. Fishing these shrimp and prawn imitations super slow just gives you a chance at a later fish and might even save your session. So hopefully you're picking up on all the reel movement, all this real subtle stuff, and just trying to keep tension with that line, like the slightest of tension, still letting it sink down, but keeping that shrimp just balanced in the water with its little legs crawling. And the whole time while I'm talking to you, I'm watching what's happening with this bank and seeing the way that it's sort of undulating in and out, and if there's some bigger rocks that sort of come out a bit further, I'm throwing in front of them and trying to let it sort of drift around to get into the face where the jacks might be sitting. It's just popped out. Like I said, these are really loose, so you want to make sure it's correctly rigged. Just like that. The looseness isn't really a bad thing, to be honest, because it just means that the action of the lure, it's a much more open, free action of the lure. You can see here, like fallen timber, it's an obvious target. And anywhere where you've got like that lay down now where it's just sort of just gracing the top of the water, you want to be throwing along that, bringing it along the edge of that, or just dropping it down. You bring it over a log, you drop it down. If you can feel cover or structure that you're rolling around, you don't have to rip it, you're more likely to get snagged that way. It's a very realistic presentation just to drag it over a log, around a rock or whatever, and then to let it just pop down and drop. The whole time I'm trying to be as conscious as I can of the batter of the rock wall and trying to let it go down as close as I can. Like the jacks are tight in there, eh? They're just sitting peering out from their little cave. Often it's rare that they'll be like free swimming off the wall. Most of the time they're tucked in there just waiting to ambush something. So you're trying to keep it as close as you can. You don't have that vibe and that presence or the paddling tail of a big plastic or anything to pull it out. You've just got like that visual appeal with the tiny little legs going. So you need to keep it as close and as visually, you know, appealing to those jacks, like right in front of their face. So a couple of the other options real quick, like James Holt's production prawns, like those swim prawns by Holt Production, they're fantastic as well, but you've got to fish a lot lighter jig head and everything to get that really slow drop that you want. And what else is good? Like Xeric live shrimp, live target fleeing shrimp are okay. I prefer like a much bigger profile for a mangrove jack, like something like this by Savage Gear, or the bigger live shrimp by Xeric and the Akuta prawns. They're all really good. Live Target makes some hybrids, and so does Savage Gear, which are pretty good. I've got them in there. I'll go through them in the other video. And another really good one is the Shads lures, actually. The little tail on the Shads lures is super effective. Just seen a bust up. Just gonna see if I could crack that. Maybe a trev. But yeah, so hopefully that sort of helps you with some of your concepts or your skills or things that you think about when you're drifting on a rock wall. The other thing too is when you're drifting, like if you're drifting with the tide and you're sort of moving fairly quick and then you slow right down and you're like, what? That's usually a deep hole. And you'll come up to them and you'll just sit there in the kayak. You're sitting on the money spot. So if you noticed in your drift, when you're going along these rock walls, that everything just slows down, generally that's because the water has just like gone out from underneath you and you're sitting in a deeper hole. And usually what I'll do then is like just drift out of that, turn around and cast back and drop it and drag it down through the deep hole of the rock wall. Anyway, let me know how you go if you're getting onto some fish doing this sort of technique, fishing along these rock walls with these shrimp. I reckon it's super effective, and it can be on the shallow banks just the same. But I just had a couple of questions about fishing on these rock walls after I did a rock wall tactics video for jacks. I didn't talk about these, so I just decided to put a video together for that. So hopefully that sort of covered a few points for you to think about and maybe try out next time you're out on the water. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments. I love reading your comments, and the engagement on this channel is fantastic at the moment. If you're only new to my channel, make sure you subscribe. I've got new stuff coming all the time, like tips and tactics videos and then little vlog style adventures. So there's a lot happening this season. I'm really enjoying doing these videos at the moment, especially during Christmas holidays. It's a real treat to be able to pump out as much as I am, like 3 videos a week at the moment. So yeah, make sure you keep watching and I'll keep making the videos. I'll see you in the next one.